Check, check. We're doing content. Content. All right. A little bit of a lecture today. I think a good one. Following up from the last video lecture, which was on modernism and the setup to post-human modernism, as opposed to a humanist modernism, as I discussed in that video. This one is just going to be on Paul Virilio, well, mostly just Paul Virilio, who's someone you don't get to know him in classes very often. I don't remember how I first stumbled upon it, but it was never in a class, and you may never have heard of him. But he's a quite interesting thinker in the vein of Walter Benjamin and Jean Baudrillard, and quite fascinating. He's very interdisciplinary and got a lot to say about everything. So I've been looking at him lately. My next video projects are inspired by his work, particularly the information bomb. So I'm excited to introduce this to you. There's a lot in there. He's prophetic in the same way that Baudrillard is, that he didn't know how right he was, but he only died a few years ago, whereas Baudrillard died I guess 18 years ago. So he got to see a lot more of the effects of the web. Though the book that I read specifically was written in 1997, Information Bomb. And I also read Speed and Politics, which was written in 1977. So 20 years apart. The Information Bomb takes up really what the cybernetic effects of networked computing are going to be. But interestingly, he doesn't diverge from his thesis at all that was posited in the 1977 book. So he was writing about speed and politics. The book is called Speed and Politics. And in that book, speed was about trains, planes, and automobiles, and particularly how those things are used for war. So the speed of controlling space that way. And then his thesis drifted nicely into controlling space through information, especially information at the speed of light, which is one of the terms he likes to say, because, of course, we have information from satellites, from wireless technology, from our phones, and all of that happens at the speed of light. So space goes from becoming a sort of an obstacle to even less of an obstacle. And he's very interested in space and geography and territories and the layouts of cities and war zones and everything you can think of, including cinema and art. I haven't read his books on cinema and art. I haven't got to them yet. But I've read about 5 books of his, and they're all worth a look. If you want something systematic, then it's got to be Speed and Politics. Though it's a little bit out of date because, like I said, it's about trains, planes, and automobiles rather than the speed of modern day communication via networked computing and satellites and the internet. So if you haven't watched the previous video, I don't know if I just mentioned this or not, but this is just a follow-up to that. And it's a little bit of a dark turn apropos humanism. We tend to think of humanism as something good and positive, visionary for the future of humans, and post-humanism as something bad. But that kind of depends on your perspective. I mean, as humans, of course, we'd like to be the center of the world, but perhaps that was never the case. That was perhaps a philosophical prejudice, religious prejudice, and so on. Now, Virilio, despite writing almost exclusively on what could be considered post-humanism, is kind of a humanist. So let's get into that. So we're still on cybernetics, and cybernetics, except for that one time that it almost happened, cybernetics is almost exclusively not used to the ends of humans. I think you can say that pretty definitively, which comes back to Heidegger, of course, as one of the original philosophers of technology. And he always uses this word destiny. Like the destiny of technology is to close the horizon of what we used to think nature was. And in that nature, human nature is included. So if you know Heidegger, because of the importance of language to an openness to being, and especially poetic language, Dasein, or roughly the human being or the human mode of being, is a special opening onto the horizon of being in general. And he says the Greeks were particularly good at this, and Virilio has his own spin on the Greeks, where he talks about how their cities were more human, far more human than the modern city, with Weber and Dickens and some of the things that I talked about last time. So I don't know if the pre-Socratic Greeks understood being better. I mean, I wouldn't guess that we understand being very well at all, and even less so than when these books were written in the 60s and 70s, because almost all of our time is mediated by very recent technologies that we are only starting to see the effects of. Now, Virilio predicted some of the effects, but we're going to get there. And in terms of this thinking, non-technical thinking, I think we've all probably had a few experiences of it. Religious experiences could come to mind, or particularly aesthetic experiences where you're struck by the beauty of art or music, and there's a sense of completeness or holism to reality where you feel like you belong there. Whereas I'm inclined to say that a great deal of our experience in technology, even though we all love it so much, is feeling like we don't really belong here, or we don't belong here like that. Like, it's the communication is artificial. It produces new sicknesses and internet addiction, and you feel like you have to participate in things that you don't want to participate in. And that's the other side of technological invention. And for Heidegger, this isn't an accident. It's because the way that technology comes to be is produced by instrumental rationality. It's what can we do with nature? Can we make nature useful to us? And in terms of the human mind as a part of nature, or what we used to consider a part of nature, a lot of these machines are designed to get you addicted to them, to make you dependent on them. And that in itself produces kinds of sicknesses that we never would have experienced before, or we wouldn't even know could exist. So the relationship between human being and technology is that not only does technology reveal being in one way, which is what Heidegger says it does, the enframing, but if that's our life, if our life is technical, then that's going to be our experience of ourselves eventually too. And that's kind of why I say that Heidegger is the first, and that would also be incorrect to say, but Heidegger is kind of the first extended consideration of what technology does to human being. Now I'm skipping over Walter Benjamin, who can also be thrown in there, but Virilio is much more in the vein, well, maybe not more in the vein of Heidegger, but he is in the vein of Heidegger as well as Benjamin. So I don't know. Like I've had, you kind of have these holistic experiences. And for me, I don't know if this is the true for everybody, but it happens when I'm pretty existentially or emotionally fragile. And then I read a piece of poetry. I remember like one time I was reading Wallace Stevens, who's an Anglo poet. I don't know if he's English or American, but something in there for whatever reason just hit me in that moment really hard. And it's kind of what you'd call like the sublime or the real, or this thing where there's a reality opens up to you in a different way. And if Heidegger's right, we're going to expect that to happen less and less, because our increasingly technical lives, while being a lot more comfortable, also close off that originary experience. And that's kind of the reason that Heidegger decided, fuck this, I'm done with this. And then went into a cabin in the Black Forest to watch water drip out of a water pump and then write about it, and refused to use a typewriter because he only wanted to write by hand. So, that's one solution. It might be the only solution. But since I'm supposed to be making content on the internet, making quiet content, it's not how you do it. Unfortunately, quiet content doesn't get played. It's the loud content that gets played. So what we can do via Virilio is dissect and cross-section the loudness to kind of understand what's really happening there. This is a lot more quiet than the rest of the content that I make, but hopefully it can inspire some reflection on these themes. So last thing about Heidegger, there was this interview that I referenced last time where Heidegger says that only a God can save us. And a patron reminded me of another part of that interview where Heidegger mentions cybernetics. Now, I've read more Heidegger than I've read almost anybody else, and I don't ever remember him using the word cybernetics. And I didn't even remember him using it in this interview until it was pointed out to me. But he does. So let me quote at length. And if this is boring, then you're just practicing quietness. Also, I recommend painting. I could turn painting into content, which is sort of like the dream, right? But the practice of just getting off a computer for 2 days and doing something with really an entirely different sensory apparatus, even though it's still your eyes and still your hands, the mediation, and I haven't painted in a long time, but the mediation feels different. And I would go so far to say as it feels better. It feels realer and is the opposite of anxiety inducing, which is kind of the effect of like smartphones, I think, overall and in general. So if you play music, maybe that's a way out. If you learn how to draw, if you don't know how to, or if you do know how to, or painting, these things that use your hands besides your smartphone, there's something to that in the tangibility and the efficacy of that just causes this all over wash of information that we are usually inundated with. It kind of causes it to recede. So I don't offer self-help, and this is not self-help, but it is, in a sense, therapeutic. I think that's fair to say. It's therapeutic. Anyway, I'm glad that I have the option to do that also. So this interview took place in 1966. I'll just read a very short portion of it. It's with Der Spiegel. So Heidegger says to the interviewer, the possibility of experience, of being needed, and of being prepared for these new possibilities is concealed in what makes up what is most modern technology's own. Thinking can do nothing more than to help humans to this insight, and philosophy is at an end. Important point there. The role philosophy played up to now has been taken over by the sciences today. To sufficiently clarify the effect of thinking, we must have a more in-depth discussion of what effect and what affecting can mean here. So he's opposing thinking to whatever technology does for us. For this, careful differentiations need to be made between cause, impulse, support, assistance, hindrance, and cooperation. But we can only gain the appropriate dimension to make these differentiations if we have sufficiently discussed the principle of sufficient reason. Philosophy dissolves into the individual sciences. That is, today it does. Psychology, logic, and political science. Then the interviewer asks him, and what takes the place of philosophy now? And Heidegger's answer is one word: cybernetics. So he opposes thinking. First of all, philosophy's over. Bold claim for the 20th century's greatest philosopher. Philosophy's over. Thinking still exists. Thinking in the sense that he's describing, kind of what I was trying to get at, this sense of wholeness, being, that you're part of something, that you're dependent on something, that time exists before you and goes after you, and being able to see that. As opposed to cybernetics, which is taking over the sciences in the 60s, especially, I should say, the applied sciences. And in terms of the applied sciences, this is what gets paid for. And skipping ahead to the end, what gets paid for is what the military, specifically the US military, decides gets funded, including this medium that we're all in at the very moment, the internet. So the old thinking, or the old philosophy, I should say, metaphysics, is dead, ontotheology, and our intelligence is dead with it. Now our intelligence is artificial intelligence. It's because of the way that technology sets out. It sets out to use and to make. It always has what Heidegger would consider narrow goals in mind. And I brought this up last time with respect to the humanists. They had very broad goals. They had huge goals, like the apotheosis of human beings to become more like God by being creative and learning shit. No one aspires to that anymore, but people do aspire to invent a new app and get a patent for it and get rich. And that's kind of the limit of human potential, is for a lot of people, at least, is to be Elon Musk, to be considered very intelligent, to become very rich, and to be a technical wizard. And for Heidegger, he said that's the principle of what our rationality has become. Our rationality no longer looks to wholeness. Philosophy is broken up into psychology, social science, political science, and so on. We don't have a unified view of anything anymore, and only a god could save us from that. You can't put Humpty Dumpty together again once we have Elon Musk. So philosophy is at an end. Cybernetics is going to replace all thinking, and now we have Virilio. So I'm going to introduce him a little bit. I did look up his biography to give you a sense, because I'm sure a majority probably have not heard of him before. I think that's because he's not disciplinary enough to get studied in most university classes, and he's too, I don't know, not famous enough to get mentioned online enough. So Virilio is pretty fascinating as a thinker. He is not a philosopher and is not trained in philosophy. That doesn't mean he's not philosophical or apt or creative, but he doesn't his references aren't the tradition so much as someone like even Baudrillard, Derrida, Deleuze, who are constantly engaging with the tradition of, Marx, Hegel, Husserl. Virilio actually does engage with Husserl. That's the one exception, though. So he is actually, he's a professor, and I guess he got a degree in, I'm not sure exactly, in architecture. And before he became a professor, his job was running around with Henri Matisse, the French painter, fixing and installing stained glass windows in churches, of all things. So he died only a few years ago, actually. And his writing styles, if you're looking for someone who's similar, is Walter Benjamin, probably, Baudrillard, Marshall McLuhan. So he's not really restricting himself in terms of discipline. And he jumps all over the place, and he's actually good at it. A lot of people jump all over the place, and they're not so good at it. I think he has a holistic vision of what's happening to the world. He knew Merleau-Ponty also. I don't know if they were friends, but he knew him personally. So you could call him something of an interdisciplinary historian. He references pop culture often, just as much as French literature. So Bill Gates, Tyra Banks, CNN, alongside Victor Hugo, and then in the next chapter, he'll look at a medieval map of Paris and argue something about space. So even though it's a shotgun blast approach, he's pretty prophetic at it. He was this I got from probably Wikipedia. He was a professor of architecture at the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris between 1969 and 1999. He describes himself as an urbanist thinker, or a thinker of metropolis, or a thinker of the city. It's a strange term, urbanist. I think if you read Benjamin, the Arcades Project would be something similar, I think. So I don't know if that's the best description. I would describe him as a philosopher of technology, really, and specifically like a romantic phenomenologist, because almost everything that he writes is how technology is destroying the phenomenology that we used to have. So he's a little bit nostalgic for the past in that sense, that we lost something, or that we're in the process continuing to lose something of our humanity in the way that the city is constructed. Because the way that the city is structured, and the state eventually defines what we think space is, and that in turn defines our place in space or in the world. And it's closed, or increasingly enclosed. So you'll see some parallels with what Max Weber thought of capitalism, as I talked about last time. So he liked Husserl, and technology makes Husserl's perceptual horizon. Husserl was, I don't want to say the last like traditional philosopher, but it's something like that. And I don't really know how to describe it, but Husserl's kind of the last armchair philosopher might be useful. And I hesitate to say armchair philosopher because, you know, all of the 16th century guys, Spinoza and Descartes, were all doing science at the same time. They're doing like optics and experiments at the same time. But Husserl, maybe this is a good way to describe it. Husserl's one of the last people whose language is transparent to them. Because after Heidegger, unless you're an analytic, there is no transparency to language. Language is fundamental. It changes meaning. Language creates meaning. It doesn't just report on it. Now, the way that Husserl writes, when I say armchair, it's kind of like Descartes in his armchair. So if I were to just sit and consider my own thought, then that would be philosophy. And then you can create whatever concepts you want. You can generate concepts by putting words on it. And putting the words on it is not changing the meaning for Husserl. So he's the last of that, of what we kind of think of as a philosopher, as a, you know, old bearded man stroking his chin while he contemplates the meaning of life. Because after that, as soon as Heidegger is Husserl's student, as soon as you get after that, you're not allowed to pretend like language is transparent anymore. You're not allowed to consider that you can just consider experience outside of having experience. So Heidegger does that with both language and technology, as I've been discussing. Technology changes the horizon of the world. And Virilio recognizes this, and he's nostalgic for that old world, I think, because he says we used to have a whole perceptual horizon. You can consider the humanist horizon. We used to have a humanist horizon full of potential, full of space to move, and now there is no horizon. There's only the screen. The screen is in front of you. And I mean, it's true for me. I spend all my time talking into artificial ears, being stared at by artificial eyes, the lens, and, you know, hopefully I'm not contributing to it. I would like to think that this kind of content is actually contrary to the screen as horizon, but my other shit is definitely not. It makes it worse. Makes attention spans lower. So anyway, back to, where was I? Oh, Virilio. The horizon's replaced by screens. Phenomenology's done, and he's sad that it's done. So he brings up philosophers once in a while, but more often he brings up these theorists that are adjacent to philosophy. Now we have a discipline for them all, right? So Marshall McLuhan, now we'd consider that media studies. And von Clausewitz, we'd call him military theory or something like that. So now we have a name for everything. But back in the day, they were kind of the first one into their own space, I think you could say. So von Clausewitz was like a Hegelian, but just wrote about war. And McLuhan was... Check mic. My half an hour's done. I don't even know in which department McLuhan taught at. It's down the road from me at University of Toronto, but he kind of did his own thing. Media studies wasn't there until he kind of invented it. So he brings up, or Virilio brings up McLuhan, von Clausewitz, French authors and poets, none of whom I know anything about. He wrote a book on cinema also, so there's something for everybody in this. what I like is that he's able to synthesize all these disciplines, kind of Renaissance man type of thing, and bring out a line that I really believe is true in all of them. So I'm going to discuss two of those lines. Now, this I thought was interesting. He describes himself as an anarcho-Christian in an interview. He said, I'm an anarcho-Christian, which is not something that we'd see often in someone's Twitter handle. I don't know if it could be a thing. I don't know. And what's interesting is Heidegger, McLuhan, and Virilio are all Catholics. So for whatever reason, Catholics are good at the philosophy of technology. I don't know. There's something in that Jesuit water. So Virilio is actually kind of a humanist. And McLuhan is also. I heard an anecdote about McLuhan that he wouldn't let all he did was write about TV and television, would not have a TV in the house, or at least not let his children watch TV because he thought it would destroy their minds, despite writing about this cool medium and the global village. He didn't want them corrupted by it. So the main thing that Virilio is known for, I think I mentioned this last time, is that history is not a history of ideas. It's not a history of the idea, especially. So contra Hegelianism. But it's also not a history of economics, contra Marxism. He brings this up explicitly and says political discourse gets this wrong by making everything about class distinctions and class war, which is true in a secondary sense, but it's missing what comes first. And what comes first is technology and military logistics, which includes the police. So in the history of military logistics and technology, we start with cities or city-states, and then gradually expands up to what we now would call the Westphalian state, which are these giant countries in a lot of cases, unified by language, unified by laws. You could probably Napoleon is like kind of the greatest example that Hegel says that Napoleon embodied the history of the time, which is true in the sense that he made France into a country. I know there's a lot of caveats to be included in there, but the modern state is a unified entity because, for Virilio, because of the technologies that control space and time. So these are armies, yes, but also military logistics, the ability to feed those armies. World War II, Virilio grew up during and uses it as an example a lot. If someone's about speed, he's very interested in the German Blitzkrieg because the French were sitting there waiting for another war like World War I. So they had built a whole bunch of bunkers saying, we're going to control the space with bunkers. They weren't expecting the speed of warfare to have changed, which is why it took the Nazis like a month to conquer France, because they just drove around the bunkers. So we're looking at how through time, if you read his book, Speed and Politics, how through time empires, states are able to conflict, and here's the big term, they're ruled by dromology or dromocracy. And dromos is the Greek word for race. So any type of race you can think of that involves technology, we got the arms race, we got the space race, we got, I don't know, whatever it is now, the app race. the self-driving car race. These races for technology are what define states, and how states define themselves in turn are how individuals see and define themselves as citizens, but also they think of themselves as citizens, but what they don't realize is that they're also being overwritten, in a sense, by the technology that the state endorses and demands that you use. So the product of the car is, first of all, the suburb. A car makes suburbs possible, but it also creates the type of person who embodies a suburb, which are, compared to someone who lives in the city, they're more sedentary, for example, because they can't walk anywhere. You can't walk anywhere if you live in a suburb. You got to get in your car to drive, which paradoxically, you invent this means of motion, and now you're forever sitting still. A parallel example is you invent the computer, which is the fastest technology the world has ever seen because it operates at light speed through fiber optics. So you invent the computer with the internet, and now you've also invented the cubicle worker, who is the most sedentary of all humans in all history. So the faster technology gets, the less humans move, which designs a new type of human that can't really feel at home in this world. And that's just to say, like, it produces a certain type of anxiety, but also that we're, fatter, lazier. If you want to not be lazy, now you have to pay to get a gym membership, which is just going to a room for the express purpose of working out instead of, expending energy in your life, because all of the energy output is now done by machines. So you just get into the car, you get into your car, drive to the gym, work out there, and then go back to your suburban home, as the case may be. Doesn't apply to everybody, of course, but the more technology that you invent, the more types of humans you invent, and the less humans do, in a sense. And he goes into the whole history of suburbs. Apparently it was invented by a French military engineer. So there's even a military history in the creation of suburbs. This other example I've heard it anecdotally, and I've found one citation that supports it. But Eisenhower was obviously the general for D-Day in World War II, but he came back and became president. And one of the things he did in the 50s was set up this highway commission to build interstates in the United States. So interstate highways. And the dude he put in charge of this expressly said, we want these highways to be durable, but we also want them to be useful for defense, which is a weird thing to say. But to that end, they built the entire interstate system out of concrete, whereas it's much easier to build with asphalt, but asphalt can't bear as much weight. So I couldn't find a reference for this, but the anecdote I heard that lines up with the guy who did the Interstate Highway Commission is that they needed the highways to be built out of concrete so that they could support the weight of a tank, just in case. You don't know what they're going to be used for, if they're going to be used for quelling rebellions in the future, or if they're going to be used in case another country invades the continental United States. But whatever it's for, the interstate highway is now designed so that tanks can drive on it. Again, couldn't find the direct source. If you know where it is, let me know. But at least the driver or the guy who designed it said, we need this to be useful not only for transportation, but for defense. So what the interaction of territory, control of territory, and technology is important here. Technology and design, I could say. So Virilio's most famous book, Speed and Politics, which is 97, I want to say. 77. No, 97 is the other one. 77. He has a kind of a hot take on nuclear war. And nuclear war, nobody wants to use nukes, generally speaking. That's why mutually assured destruction worked during the Cold War mostly. No one wants to use nukes except this fucker, what's his name? General MacArthur, who they're fighting the Korean War. I mean, I laugh, but this is like, there's another Earth somewhere that had this future. The General MacArthur's like, we should just keep going. Let's just finish this off when he's fighting in Korea, meaning let's just take out the Soviet Union and China so we can just be done with this communism thing. Because at that point, the US has nukes and no one else does. So he drew up this plan where it's like, I'm going to drop 30 nukes on China and 30 nukes on the Soviet Union simultaneously. This is going to create this radiation belt, which would be impossible for their troops to cross. Meanwhile, we'll just take like all of Manchuria, we'll take all of Korea, and we'll slowly encroach and just wipe out both the Soviet Union and China. Luckily, it wasn't his finger on the trigger, because holy shit. And I don't know nothing about nuclear winter or how powerful those nukes were, but this guy could have ended the world, and he was advocating for the end of the world. But other than that, cooler heads prevailed. And what Virilio says about nukes is that it's about spatial control, right? It's not that you can just kill a whole bunch of people if you drop a nuke on them. That's an effect. But no matter how many bombs you have, it doesn't offer the same control that a nuke does. Because a nuke means that you know that you can control their army's movement in a sense to deter it, deterrence. They can't move their armies because they know if they do, you could nuke the army, you could nuke a city. So what the nuke represents is a form of spatial control that was not offered by aircraft, which was the other spatial controller before ICBMs existed. So we have this whole progression of military technologies, first of all, like Roman roads and horses, to armored cars, to tanks, to planes, naval empires, I should mention, because it's obviously much easier to move stuff over an ocean than it is over land. So the fastest growing empires and the most powerful states in each case are defined by how fast technology can move. And nukes represent the stoppage of movement, the deterrence of movement. But the nuclear age then gives way to the information age. So this is where Virilio's books from 1977 switch to his later works, because he's writing as all this technology is being invented. He wrote a book on the Gulf War. He wrote a book on information when in 97 they had just cloned that sheep. That sheep was the first cloned animal. Dolly, I think her name was. So he's writing as information is taking over space, literally. Outer space, space down here. We got GPS, we got mapping systems. Information is now instant, and all of it occurs at the speed of light, at the speed of electromagnetic radiation. So not just visible light, but nothing takes any time anymore, at least in the small distances that we're talking about. Outer space, outer space would be the exception to that. So this implies kind of what Heidegger said. This implies a sort of spatial or empirical, in terms of an empire destiny of technology. We don't have a one world government, but only with something like the internet could a one world government even be considered. Or, I don't know, even the EU, which is just a massive amount of people, different countries, different languages, and you can turn it into an economic power. And we might be seeing the consolidation of that. I don't know, that Brexit thing throws a wrench into it. Anyway, the point is, you could not imagine a world government even 30 years ago, probably, at least not on the scale that we can today. And what I can cast into relief here, like compared to the Cybersyn project, we could call Cybersyn a humanistic cybernetics, which means cybernetics is subordinate to human interest, human desire, and what's good for people, like at the individual level. All the rest of cybernetics, as I've said before, dispenses with the human in that we don't need it. The human's inefficient. They take too long to make decisions. We're better off without human decisions being involved at all. So the way that this cashes out in terms of sci-fi is something like humans are directly enslaved, and they're enslaved in the way that we would consider enslavement, or they're being exterminated. So like the Terminator, Skynet, or Matrix type scenarios. These are just sci-fi visions, though, of something that it's already underway, it's already taken place, and it's already here. And it's been here since Weber's time, right? Weber already identified this, like, our bureaucracies are not for people now. They're these systems that override, that use people to pursue their own ends. You could call them a system in that sense. Humans are a resource from Weber, right? That's visualized in the Matrix, but Weber said it in 1912. So humans as a resource is the destiny, in a sense, of cybernetics. Except for Cybersyn. So this anarcho-Christian thing that Virilio has going on, the Christian part is where the humanism slides in. He's not writing all this and celebrating it. He's not an accelerationist. He's almost giving us a cautionary tale and warning, like, we don't know what the accident of this will look like, because every technology produces accidents. So the car creates a car crash. Building the Titanic invents the shipwreck. Obviously it didn't, but you know. Inventing the stock market invents a stock market crash, which, you know, brings an entire country to a halt. So the more globalized technology gets, and we're finally, for the first time ever, in basically when he wrote this book, 97, we're in a globalized world. And you could argue that before, like in the age of colonial empires, then it was becoming globalized. But now there's no spatial delay. Like this morning I Skyped with someone in Britain, or not, whatever. I could Skype with them in Britain with no time delay, Now, the night and dark thing matters a little bit, but we're under a false light where everything is bright at any time that you want it to be. There's no diurnal calendar for us to follow anymore, which was the basis of, every primeval religion. So we're going into this post-human future that is globalized because space doesn't exist anymore. And you can kind of connect this back to the Merleau-Ponty thing that Virilio is working with here, is we're supposed to be in space. We're supposed to have a certain attitude towards space. And when we don't know what. I'm going to get to some possible examples of what in a bit. But this is disorienting. And we're not talking about disorienting from even an evolutionary point of view, though I assume that would be part of it. But we invent sicknesses that we won't know how to deal with. And really, the end of cybernetics just might be the end of us entirely. Maybe not humans as organisms, but everything that we considered humans could be, could do, would be. And then we're into sort of Nick Land territory, potentially. So in this context, Virilio's critical understanding of states and current states, the anarcho part, the anarchist bent of his anti-state analysis of states, or his critique of states, is that these metropoles and these Westphalian states that we have now, they're not good for us. And this is where he comes off as romantic in the vein of Heidegger, because his answer is the same as Heidegger, except where Heidegger says, let's go back to the Greek poets. Virilio's like, what the Greek states, those city states, that was where humans were most at home. They're not alienated from each other. They that's the ideal size for a community to exist as, is like a Greek polis. But the polis keeps extending because technology enables more control and domination of space. So his humanist perspective here becomes pretty apparent, because the project of state formation is the control and mastery of territory, which is functionally possible because of technology. So you can add all the Marxist analysis after that, or neo-Marxist. You can bring in ideology and mind control and hegemony. But what happens first, and what Marx doesn't recognize, according to Virilio, is that first is the control of space. Then all those hierarchies get set up afterwards, which I kind of buy, because you can, if you're setting up a colonial exploitation, if you're setting up an exploitation colony of someone who's never encountered your technology before, ideology is the last thing on their minds. They don't have to believe anything that you say. All they have to believe is that you have guns and horses and that they don't. So, Marx would have an answer to that as well, of course. You can own these technologies only because a statist system has built them that is built on exploitation, where these are the forces of mass labor that enable you to build, well, not a horse, but enable you to have the kind of hierarchy in which breeding horses is useful and building tanks is useful. You need a working class to be able to set up your colony in the first place. But anyway, we're not going to do that. The transition of feudalism to capitalism would be the example. But you don't need ideology for Virilio's politics to work. He does bring up ideology through communications technology. But what you need in a state is the power to move shit really fast. And that's kind of an inverse relation to the size of your state. So the British built railroads in India and were able to control like millions of people. They were not doing it necessarily saying, aha, we're going to control this, but that's just the effect of the speed of a train. Same thing in Canada. If Canada is a long ass country, but if you have a railroad, you can, quell a rebellion here, and you only need one line basically. And that enables you to control the space. So for Virilio, that's primary. Class politics is an addition to that, or secondary to that. So the city-state, or polis, and this includes the police, right? When he talks about military logistics, also think of police logistics and police surveillance. The pre-modern formation of the urban political center, so I don't know, the Greeks probably. For Virilio, this is a model of political community, which is more properly adjusted to the phenomenology of the human body, meaning that we can comprehend what meaningful interaction over a small distance is. When we have states that are this large, a state that's as large as Canada, that you're never gonna see in your whole life, you're never gonna meet your peers. You can't build alliances over that large of a space in a political, even electoral democratic sense, because your interests are so different. These smaller states is better, which is why he's an anarcho-Christian, I guess. The space that these Westphalian nation states take up now is inhuman already. So, yeah, we're just stuck in that, I guess. We're stuck in too much space, or we're stuck in a spatial organization of the earth that we don't really understand. So he doesn't use the word, but the word could easily be thrown in here. This is alienating. And it's alienating at a level of the human body even. Okay. So, I don't know what to say about this, like the Greeks had it right thing, but I think we can all relate at least a little bit to the alienation of the modern city. So the project of the modern city, and think of city in a broad sense, is a totality, achieving in a totality of human action that you could relate to something like Deleuze's control societies. Cybernetics makes countries, automated countries possible, and automatic cities possible in a way that they never were before. And you need a whole bunch of other stuff to make cities, like agricultural space that you also control so that you can feed the people there, for example. So Virilio is really interested in all this stuff. Sorry, I had to cut. Virilio is really interested in this stuff. I'm not so much in terms of urban planning. If you are interested in that, you should look at all of his examples. He gives a lot in Speed and Politics. But what I'm interested in here is when he's talking about the information bomb. Now, there's 3 bombs. The atomic bomb, which prevents war through deterrence. No 2 countries that both have atomic bombs are going to go to war with each other, or they're going to do their best to avoid it. Then the information bomb. The information bomb is cybernetic total control, surveilled control of the space and time of the polis. So the city state. There's not actually a distinction between the city and the state. One's just like a gargantuan expression of the other. So the military, the police, the city, the state, they're the same as far as control of territory is concerned. So the domination of the territory, of any contested territory, goes to whoever can control space better. So this is why we have space races, arms races, tech races, and why ultimately military funding gets involved in all communications technology. Everything in your phone, from the miniature camera to digital cameras to GPS to microchips to LCD screens, is all military technology. That's not by accident, that's by design, because their interest is in controlling space. Once they've got control of the space, then they can civilianize it, commercialize it, and sell it to you, including the internet. So the same way that they're tracking insurgents in Iraq or Afghanistan, using exactly the same technology, you can track your Uber driver bringing you food. So this is about, in the first case, the reason that the military is interested in all this stuff at all is so that they can control more space. Whether it's the country next door that they want to spy on, or whether it's a country across the world that they want to invade, satellite, GPS, GIS, and now the internet makes that entirely feasible. You still got to get all the stuff over there, which it requires a different type of logistics. But in the end, all logistics is military logistics in terms of this city-state controlling territory model that he produces. So weirdly, if you're looking at the Earth, you'll see that in the last like 30, 40 years, it's suddenly got a new skin. It's got a double, an outside that it didn't have before. So for Virilio, he says the Earth has been turned inside out like an orange peel. And that's because now the entire surface is floating with satellites in space that are all communicating with each other, that are photographing the ground, that are doing whatever else satellites do. These transoceanic cables that are fiber optic, so they also use light. Everything around the world turns at light speed. So the Earth is spaceless. Speed destroys the Earth in terms of the Earth that it takes time to control. So for him, there's a double. Everything is doubled. And this is a part where I kind of disagree with him, but whatever. Everything is doubled to what's real on the Earth in the sense that we're used to experiencing it phenomenologically. And then it's operational double. And in the double, that is where cybernetics functions, where cybernetics is useful, and what cybernetics is really good at, which is making decisions quickly, sorting information faster than a human can, solving problems that a human couldn't solve, and it never has to sleep. It's unblinking, whereas humans are just worse cybernetic organisms than these algorithms are. So we think that we can know everything because everything can be seen. So this applies not only to these digital mapping technologies, not only to your phone, to image sorting, to any impossible amount of data sorting algorithms that now exist for every possible purpose, but also to you. The Human Genome Project was originally funded by the U.S. government. I think it was Department of Energy, which is kind of weird. Maybe I have that wrong. But now it's an immediately commercialized, available product to get your own genome sequenced by private companies, 23andMe, that are probably going to sell that shit. And this is terrifying to Virilio. Now, 23andMe wasn't around in 97 when he wrote this, but he said, this is one of his prophecies, this is going to be commercialized like now. And he was right. So there was no CRISPR. You know CRISPR, this thing where you can splice DNA. I want to say it's less than 10 years old. But whatever, you can take out a chunk of DNA. There's a woman who found this in some virus that you can tell exactly where to cut some string of DNA. Then you can insert new DNA in it. So the immediate function of this, they say, of course, is to, if you have a genetic-based illness, you could just take out that bad bit of DNA, put some DNA in that's not going to cause you to get sick, and you're fixed. Now, just like we have Terminator and the Matrix, there is a sci-fi element to, I think this happens in Brave New World, where they can genetically modify themselves, but the modern version is Gattaca, which is a film where they privatize DNA manipulation so that every rich person can make sure their kid is perfectly physically fit, not going to get any sicknesses. They can design their hair color, eye color, and so on, according to fashion. And everyone who's not able to be born with genetic modifications, they become this sort of subservient underclass, an immiserated underclass to the genetically modified people. I don't know when Gattaca came out, but if it was not before 97, then Virilio pretty much wrote that movie. He said what we're going to see with the information bomb first exploding and then the demographic bomb exploding is that when everything becomes information, then we're going to have a cybernetic eugenicism, which is pretty I don't know. 97's kind of, it's a little bit late to be saying that, but I mean, he saw the potential that first something is used to, let's cure diseases, but then immediately after it's commercialized into, what do you want your kid's eye color to be? But that's not Virilio's main point. One thing that I have neglected to mention so far that is why, actually, no, shut up. I did mention it in terms of crashes. You invent the car, you invent car crashes. And whoever invented the car in some machine shop in England or Belgium or wherever the internal combustion engine was invented, they didn't know they were inventing a car crash. And they didn't know that they were going to, with this invention, cause half of the species on Earth to go extinct, right? Through global warming. And an internal combustion engine is a primary cause for that. So the invention of a new technology is only ever, in very small part, the intention of the creator. The intention of the creator almost has nothing to do with the destiny of the technology. And Virilio goes a little further to say that every technology comes with a flip side, an integral accident. And you don't know what the accident's going to be. What he says with his great fear, his humanist-minded fear, is that we now have information from top to bottom, from pictures of black holes to sequences of information that represent our own genes. We also have global information. We have a global system. You can buy stocks in Chinese companies just as easy as anything else by the internet. So our entire system of finance is completely integrated globally. It's all interconnected such that a collapse in one place is going to cause a collapse everywhere. And we already have seen the beginnings of that. That's the information bomb, though. When we talk about the demographic bomb, we have these CRISPR gene cutting things that I think they're now being used in mosquitoes so that they can have mosquitoes that are unable to reproduce. And these are already alive, existing in some lab somewhere. But if a single one of those gets out and starts reproducing in the population, then that is going to render the entire population of this certain kind of mosquito unable to reproduce. And you've just made mosquitoes extinct by accident. So what Virilio might ask us is, we have this ability to cut genes. Gene cutting and genetic modification is a race. I'm sure it's highly illegal. But it's for sure being done. Like you have to know that it's being done. If it's illegal in America and less so in China, then America will do what they always do and go somewhere else and set up shop and have a genetic testing lab. But if they think the Chinese are doing it and the Chinese say, no, we're not doing it, but are secretly doing it, then everybody's doing it, right? Who knows where the technology of gene splicing and genetic modification is at this point. That would be terrifying to find out, I think. But you can bet it's going on because in line with Virilio's thesis, it's always a race. And no one's going to lose that race, because then they lose their capacity to control territory. So I think what Virilio would ask us, because he never, not to my knowledge, said anything about CRISPR. He didn't write too many books in the last 10 years, as far as I know. But if we imagine Chernobyl is the accident of nuclear energy. Just demolished a massive amount of space, birth defects for like hundreds of miles away, even 50 years later. What is the Chernobyl of CRISPR and gene splicing? That's the terrifying thought. If we could make mosquitoes unable to breed and reproduce, do we know what would happen? Like, I don't know, Jurassic Park is like the sci-fi or the pop culture example of, we can't control nature, we don't know what it'll do. But what's the fatal accident of the demographic bomb? And then we're looking at scenarios that are entirely plausible and terrifying, like Children of Men. What if one thing gets out of one lab one time, and then all of humanity is infertile after that? That's the kind of potential accident that Virilio sees coming. First of all, like global stock market crashes, something he predicts, as the world economy becomes more and more interconnected. And the cybernetic eugenicism, he doesn't elaborate on it at all in Information Bomb. Probably scared too, probably not worth elaborating on, because you can't predict the integral accident before it happens. But maybe that's a question that it's good to leave you with. What is What is the Chernobyl of genetic modification? What's the worst case scenario? What's the meltdown going to look like? The last thing is that every technology creates new sicknesses. And this is a little less dark and a little more obvious. But every technology creates new sickness. So you invent the car and you invent the train, and then you invent motion sickness at the same time. You invent the boat, and then you can invent seasickness. But you can also invent sicknesses like addictions. So the flip side of having this constant, everywhere, always on technology is a lot of what we've kind of already seen, right? It's already always bemoaned, social media is causing anorexia, blah, blah, blah. Don't know if that's true. But generalized anxiety, and again, I don't know if any of this is true, but it seems pretty true. It seems pretty likely that growing up in high school, like, thank God that there were no smartphones when I was in high school. But it seems like we are producing sicknesses, we don't even know what they are, related to anxiety, related to attention spans, related to a capacity to filter information into true and false properly, sicknesses involving memory. We don't know what they are yet. Maybe we do. I don't know. I don't pay too much attention to it. But the flip side of every technology, he's really against the idea that we are progressing, that technology is progress. That's really an antiquated idea, because every time you create a new technology, there's a new Chernobyl waiting to happen. There's a new raft of deleterious effects and diseases that are waiting to happen. We're seeing the massive disruption of political institutions. Not that that's a bad thing. I think our political institutions need to be disrupted. But whether they need to be disrupted by a bunch of boomers who get all their news from Facebook, So the accidents, the sicknesses they produce, they are unpredictable. But that's also why you can't see technology as just the progressive march of something better and something more comfortable. So we call it progress. Virilio calls it something different, pure war. And the pure war is this cosmological confrontation that has happened throughout history between humans and technology. And cybernetics for him is the final frontier of this war. Cybernetics is the thing that wipes us out. Not in the sense of humans necessarily go extinct, though that's certainly a possibility with this gene modification stuff, but also something that's already happened, that we're not human in the sense that humans used to think of themselves. Independent, free, creative, agentic, having a say in their own future. Those kinds of romantic notions of humanity are over. So we're becoming more and more the appendages of technology, whereas the older view of technology was that they were appendages of us. And it looks like the tables have been turned. So whatever the integral accident is to informatics and cybernetics, we haven't seen it yet. At least not in full. I think we've seen glimpses, but it's not come yet into full view. But I wouldn't be so hopeful as to make the mistake of not believing that they could happen. The book, one more time, Information Bomb. That was actually a summary of like 3 different books. yeah, so I'd start with speed and politics if this interests you. But if you're only interested in the information cybernetics stuff, information bomb's a good way to go. All right, so there's an hour and a half of content. If you're still here with me, I hope that was interesting. My next 2 videos are going to be on topics like this, but they won't be this in depth. So I'm happy to be able to teach it beforehand, because if you can teach it, so the saying goes, then you might know what you're talking about. So I hope that was interesting. If there's anything, the script is pretty much done for the next video, but that doesn't mean it's in stone. So if there's any parts of this that you find particularly interesting and just want to leave your reflections on it in the comments, or if you don't want to comment, message me privately through the thingy, then I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. I'd be interested to hear what parts of this resonate, what parts of this seem true. There's a lot of connections to be made. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope this was interesting enough to listen to. I love Aurelio. I love it. The thing that draws me to thinkers most often is their creativity, and he's definitely got that down. So thank you very much, and I will talk at you again sometime soon. All right.